Yes.
Professor Keel, you've told us that you were an observer at the ACVSB meetings and the meetings of the successor committee, which took over from the ACVSB. We've heard from other witnesses that those meetings were intended to be confidential and that the chair would not infrequently remind participants of the confidentiality of the meetings and what was discussed at those meetings. Did you feel able to pass on what was discussed at ACVSB meetings to colleagues within the Scottish Home and Health Department?
Absolutely.
So you were not inhibited from sharing information that you'd gleaned at those committee meetings. What about more broadly? Did you feel able to share what you'd picked up from ACVSB meetings with, for example, SNBTS?
Well, there were members of SNBTS around the ACVSB table anyway, so I didn't have to act as the conduit for that information.
If we look at RCPE 0000203_002, you'll see, Professor Keel, this is a letter from Professor Cash, 19th of June 1992, to Dr. Kendall, Chief Medical Officer. And he says in the first paragraph, as I know you're aware, the safety of blood transfusion is a matter of considerable professional importance, political sensitivity, and also of interest to the media and the law courts. Such interests and sensitivities were recognised by the Departments of Health some years ago, and there was established a committee chaired by Dr. Metters to advise ministers of this topic. And then he says this, I have a number of concerns with regard to the track record of this committee, but on this occasion I write to request that you invite members of your team to give consideration how best those responsible for the management of the SNBTS can provide a more effective input into this advisory committee, and that its output is more readily available to SNBTS management. In both these matters, current arrangements are wholly inappropriate. And if we go over the page, he continues, you'll be aware that there has in recent times been serious difficulties in France with regard to arrangements for advice on the safety of blood and blood products. Some of these difficulties are about to be the subject of very high-profile court actions in Paris. My knowledge of the French tragedy leads me to request that you use your good offices to persuade DOH colleagues that steps be taken to ensure that all members of the Advisory Committee on the Safety of Blood are invited to declare whether they have any financial interest in commercial institutions contributing to the safety of blood. Before we look at Dr. Kendall's reply, do you have any recollection or any understanding of what in particular Professor Cash was concerned about that led to the inclusion of that last paragraph?
No, I don't. I mean, I'd only been in post 3 months when this letter was written, so I don't know what John was alluding to in terms of the track record of the committee. I certainly don't know anything about declaration of financial interests and why he felt that was important.
If, for the sake of completeness, we look at Dr. Kendall's reply at SBTS 0000645_016. And Dr. Kendall said in his response to the 3rd of July 1992, in the second paragraph he refers to Dr. Mitchell and Dr. Perry being members of the advisory committee. And then in the third paragraph says, I understand for reasons which have been explained to me that the chairman of the committee has always insisted that the committee's discussions should be regarded as confidential. However, I can assure you that we will keep you advised in good time of any matter affecting the organisation and administration of the SNBTS. If there is any matter you want raised at a meeting, perhaps you could let Dr. Keel know and she will take the necessary steps. Do you recall any issues thereafter being raised by Professor Cash with you about matters being discussed at the ACVSB?
No, I don't recall any specific conversations with John about ACVSB in the context of this correspondence. But I think the response from the CMO highlights, it seems to me rather odd that with SNBTS having two members, Malcolm Mitchell and Bob Perry, on ACVSB, that John Cash should have said that the committee really wasn't considering SNBTS views or whatever form of words he used. I find, as so often with Professor Cash, his correspondence rather cryptic and difficult to untangle.
But in any event, you did not feel that the confidentiality requirement prevented you from relaying to colleagues within the SHHD what was being discussed and decided by the ACVSB, is that correct?
Oh, absolutely. Otherwise, what would the point of me have been, of me being there as an observer have been, you know? Of course, I was there to observe, take notes, and brief colleagues back at base.
Okay. We can take that down, thank you. Can I then, before I turn to ask you about some of the substantive areas of decision-making in which you were involved during your time with the Scottish Government, can I just ask you a little more about the work you undertook from 1995 onwards? In one of your statements, you have responded to a suggestion that you worked in a laboratory with Professor Ludlam, and have explained you did not work in a laboratory with Professor Ludlam, but you carried out a weekly general haematology clinic with him in the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary. Is that correct?
It is.
Did you ever work on any laboratory samples from Professor Ludlam's patients?
No.
In terms of the ongoing work that you undertook with him through the general haematology clinic, did that continue until Professor Ludlam's retirement?
Yes, it did.
Did you ever discuss with Professor Ludlam the possibility of there being a public inquiry into matters relating to infected blood in Scotland, I should say?
No.
Did you ever discuss, once the Penrose inquiry was set up, the Penrose inquiry with Professor Ludlam?
Not that I recall.
Did you ever discuss with Professor Ludlam any of his patients who'd been infected with HIV or hepatitis C or the circumstances of their infections?
No.
Did you ever discuss the issue of paying financial support or compensation to those infected or affected with Professor Ludlam?
Not that I recollect.
Can I then ask you to turn to a passage in your statement at WITN 5736003, and it should be page 3, please, Lawrence. The bottom half of the page, the paragraph numbered A5, you say there, so it should be the top of what's on your screen, Professor Keel, you refer to starting training in haematology, which we've discussed, and then you say this: during the course of my training, I became increasingly aware of the risks of viral transmission through use of blood and blood products, particularly after the discovery of HIV in 1984 and HCV in 1989. Can I just ask you a little more about your knowledge of risks of viral transmission? First of all, in relation to HIV, we've already discussed your work at York Hill with Dr. Willoughby, who left in December 1982. Can you recall whether you'd had any discussions with Dr. Willoughby or within the department at York Hill about the possibility of transmission of an agent responsible for AIDS?
No, I have no recollection of any such conversations.
And can you recall how and when you became aware of the possibility that blood or blood products might transmit an agent responsible for AIDS?
Well, in the early 80s, there were articles in the medical journals about this new entity, AIDS, about which very, very little was known other than that it was a very, very unpleasant disorder which led to death in pretty short order. So I'd been aware through the medical journals that what eventually turned out to be HIV was occurring. And I suppose after the virus was identified in 1984, it very quickly became clear that it was transmissible by blood. So I suppose the early to mid-80s.
When you moved to the Royal Infirmary in Glasgow after you left York Hill, do you have any recollection, again, of the issue of AIDS and its potential for transmission by blood or blood products being the focus of discussions and concerns in the course of 1983, whether with Dr. Forbes or Dr. Lowe or any others?
No, I can't recollect any specific conversations with any of them about that.
Then turning to hepatitis C, you recorded there the discovery of hepatitis C in 1989. Should that be a reference to 1988? Or was your understanding that it was 1989?
I'm sorry if that's a mistake. If 1988 is the correct date, I've made a mistake, sorry.
And what was your understanding, do you think, in the first half of the 80s, of the seriousness of non-A, non-B hepatitis, as it was then known?
I think the general view was that it was a relatively benign disease that disrupted liver function tests, but really had no particularly adverse effects. That was the general view at that point, which of course by the late 1980s and certainly the early 90s had changed.
Your understanding at the time that it was relatively benign, would that then have reflected, given that you were a relatively junior doctor and still undergoing haematology training at the time, would that have reflected what you were picking up from haematologists in Aberdeen and then at York Hill and then at Glasgow? Was that a shared view as far as you can recall at those institutions?
Yes, I think that would be fair to say, but also the medical literature reflected that view.
One of the pieces of research which the inquiry has considered with witnesses from time to time, and it's not a document that's been provided to you, Professor Keel, so it may not be something that you recall, but was work undertaken at Sheffield under Dr. Preston, Professor Eric Preston, and publication in 1978 of research that he'd undertaken. Without having provided you with the document, you may not be able to assist, but does that ring any bells at this stage?
Only insofar as I think Eric Preston's view was perhaps different from the majority of the profession. There were individuals who fairly early on said this or anticipated that this disease was going to be more serious than the majority of the profession. And I think Eric Preston was one of them, but as you say, I haven't seen the article.
Can I ask you to look at a ministerial briefing from 2005? It's SCGV 0000044_024. So we can see it's entitled Ministers' Meeting with Scottish Haemophilia Groups Forum on the 1st of February. And we can pick up the year from paragraph 2. It refers to the meeting scheduled for the 1st of February 2005. Annex A is said to contain lines to take and additional information and background notes. And then Annex B, additional background notes on issues previously raised by Mr. Dolan. And then if we can see it's from Sandra Faulkner. If we go to the copy list, bottom half of the page, we can see that you are there listed as one of those who would have received this briefing. I just wanted to ask you about a couple of passages in it, Professor Keel. If we go to the second page, so this is part of Annex A. It's in the context of a discussion about public inquiry. But I'm going to, if we leave aside the question of public inquiry for now, under the heading Lines to Take, it says, prior to 1985, there was no consensus amongst clinicians that HCV infection was a serious condition. And then, if we go to the next page, I want to show you another paragraph and then ask you about this. So we've got the heading Background, and then if we pick matters up, in the paragraph beginning, the hepatitis C virus was first identified in 1989. Thank you. So that reads, the hepatitis C virus was first identified in 1989. Prior to that, scientists and clinicians were aware of a new form of liver disease which occurred in haemophiliacs being treated with blood products. This included inflammation of the liver revealed on blood testing, usually asymptomatic. It became known as non-A, non-B hepatitis. There was no real scientific consensus at the time as to the health effects or risks associated with this condition, and no way in which blood or blood products could be screened for its presence. SNBTS introduced heat treatment for blood products to minimise the risk of non-A, non-B transmission in 1984, and screening for HCV in blood donations in 1991. Both of these developments were introduced as early as they reasonably could be in the light of the current scientific knowledge and technical capabilities at that time. Can we have the next paragraph on screen as well, please, Lawrence? There was therefore an awareness of the potential risks associated with blood products in the early 1980s and the need for precautions, but no evidence that might cause serious disease. On the other hand, the blood products being developed at this time offered real advances in treatment for haemophiliacs. These potentially life-saving benefits have to be considered alongside the risks which substantially emerged. So could we just have those two paragraphs on screen, Lawrence? Sorry, the two paragraphs I read out, if we could, thank you, perfect. So, Professor Keel, first of all, would it be right to understand that in terms of the medical input into this briefing, that you would be likely to be the source of medical advice?
Yes.
I just wanted to then pick up on, I think, three matters revealed by these paragraphs. The first is the reference to consensus. We saw it on the previous page, the reference to there being no consensus amongst clinicians that HCV was a serious condition, and then that's picked up here, no real scientific consensus at the time as to the health effects or risks associated with this condition. Why was consensus the way in which this advice was being put? Was there a need for consensus before action would need to be taken?
No, not in every clinical situation, but I think in this area, there was a growing body of evidence by the mid to late 1980s, such that the majority of clinicians by the end of that decade would have agreed that this was indeed a serious form of liver disease that they hitherto had thought was benign.
And then in the second paragraph that's on the screen, you've referred to the awareness of potential, the briefing refers to the awareness of potential risks. And then in the second line says this, but no evidence that might cause serious disease. Is it right to say that in the 1980s, there was no evidence that non-A, non-B hepatitis might cause serious disease? What's the source for that statement?
Well, I can't reference it, but I'm sure there would have been some evidence in some patients, but the majority of the evidence pointed to a relatively benign course for patients who were infected with what was then called non-A, non-B hepatitis, and whose main manifestation of whatever that organism was raised liver function tests, but otherwise they were well. And that was the observation, therefore, that the majority of patients, in the majority of patients, this disease ran a benign course. In fact, what was being observed was a very long prodromal course before the disease really manifested itself in terms of liver damage.
And then we can see, again, in that first paragraph that's on screen, after the reference to no real scientific consensus, the briefing continues, no way in which blood or blood products could be screened for its presence. And then there's reference to the introduction of screening for hepatitis C in 1991. There's no reference in this narrative here to surrogate testing and the possibility of surrogate testing, which was available in the 1980s, although not, as we know, introduced in any systematic way. Can you assist in understanding why surrogate testing doesn't feature as a factor to flag up to the Minister's attention?
Well, it may not be flagged in this briefing, but I seem to recollect that there was indeed a specific briefing on more than one occasion on surrogate testing. So ministers were aware of it. I guess it wasn't an issue for this specific meeting, which I think was with Philip Dolan. So presumably Philip Dolan hadn't raised the issue of ALT testing.
And then the last question on these paragraphs, the last sentence of the first paragraph says both of these developments, and that refers to heat treatment and then screening for hepatitis C, were introduced as early as they reasonably could be in light of the current scientific knowledge and technical capabilities at that time. Now, of course, this is 2005, and this is 4 years after the judgment of Mr. Justice Burton in the case of A and the National Blood Authority. Not, as we've heard, a decision focusing on negligence, but a decision under the Consumer Protection Act. But having regard to the findings of Mr. Justice Burton, which I know you were aware of, we see references to it in the documentation, was it correct to tell a minister in 2005 that screening for HCV was introduced as early as it reasonably could be in light of current scientific knowledge and technical capabilities?
I believe it was accurate. the virus was only identified in 1989, or if that date's wrong, 1988. Anyway, there then ensued a period of very intense scientific focus on developing a test that could be applied routinely to blood transfusion, screening of donors. The first tests were indeed available earlier than 1991, but they were non-specific and lacking in sensitivity and specificity, with the result that many false positive results were generated. So until those tests improved, and indeed confirmatory tests were available, because the blood transfusion service never introduces just one test without having available the technology to confirm that by another scientific method. So until both of those things, improved specificity and sensitivity and the means of confirming a positive test were available, the transfusion services, other than in little sort of areas that introduced it on an ad hoc basis, the transfusion services preferred to wait until the science was in a better state. And those tests were much more reliable than the initial ones produced in 1989 and 90.
Now, in the period 1989 through to 1991, when the question of the introduction of screening for hepatitis C was under consideration by the ACVSB, you were, of course, not then working for the Scottish Home and Health Department and not attending meetings of the ACVSB. What's the basis, the factual basis for your views as you've just described to us? What are they based on? Well,
on many of the papers that you supplied for this inquiry to me, and it's historical knowledge gleaned from those papers and from colleagues that were in post during this period, and I later came into contact with when I was appointed in 92.
I'm going to turn to now a different topic, but one which would have come across your desk fairly early on in your role as Senior Medical Officer, and that's the introduction of the payment scheme for HIV-infected recipients of blood and tissue. If we could go, please, to SCGV 40239_024. So this is a minute from Mr. Tucker. It's dated the 9th of April 1992. That we don't need to turn to it, but his name and the date appears on the final page. And we can see it's addressed to the Private Secretary of the Chief Executive. Would that be the Chief Executive of the WIC, the National Health Service that you referred to earlier?
Yes, and the head of the Management Executive that I mentioned earlier. So really the head of department at that point.
And then we can see it's copied to you. And if we look at I don't need to read all of it, but if we look at the second paragraph, we can see the context. It says, the Secretary of State has agreed to the broad principles of the scheme in response to my submission of the 20th of February 1992. There's been an inevitable delay while the scheme has been worked out in detail, but we've worked closely with DOH officials and the timetables have been coordinated. In the form now proposed, the Scottish scheme does not depart from the basic principles and also follows closely the terms of the settlement for haemophiliacs. There are differences between the Scottish and English schemes, but these are mainly a reflection of the separate Scottish legal views and are mainly presentational. And then there's reference to the panel that was going to be set up, which was a different panel in Scotland than the panel set up by the Department of Health in England. And then if we just go over the page, please. Just to paragraph 5. It says, neither scheme makes mention of lifestyle of the claimant as a factor in determining entitlement. This is a sensitive issue, needs to be dealt with carefully. Decision on entitlement will, however, be taken on a balance of probability test, and therefore lifestyle may be a relevant consideration in cases of doubt. Our application form, in common with the D of H form, does seek to elicit some factual information on background lifestyle. Then it asks the applicant's doctor whether the applicant had attended a drug dependency clinic or genitourinary medical clinic. The D of H form goes further in asking whether the applicant had been in contact with persons from countries where AIDS is prevalent. They consider that if they did not do so, it might be thought that they were closing their minds to the possibility of other risk factors. The advice which we've received has been to the effect that we should avoid direct reference to this and leave it to the panel to use their discretion to seek further information which an applicant undertakes in any event in making the application to supply. Now, so there's one difference identified between the Department of Health approach in England and the Scottish approach. Had you been involved in providing the advice that's referred to here, or involved in the development of the scheme in Scotland?
No, I mean, this was, very, very early on in my role as SMO, and I wasn't involved in developing this advice.
If we then just go to the next page in paragraph 10, just to pick up on what your involvement might then have been in assessing claims. Paragraph 10, if we pick it up in the fifth line, when the claims are received, these will be scrutinised in the department in consultation with medical and legal advisors. Where the cases are straightforward, the department will make the payments due in accordance with the claimant's wishes, and then when there's any doubt, the case will be referred to the panel for a decision, and payment will be made by us, if appropriate, thereafter. And then I don't think we need to put it up on screen, but when the letter was in due course sent out to Directors of Public Health drawing attention to this scheme, and for the transcript it's at MACK 5044, it says that any medical inquiries should be addressed to Dr. Keel. Can you recall what your involvement was in assessing claims for payment under the Scottish scheme for those infected with HIV through blood or tissue?
I'm afraid, given the passage of time, my memory is really not very clear in this. I mean, obviously my name was on the letter as the medical contact, but in all honesty, I can't remember ever scrutinising any applications. And I know that it says when the claims are received, these will be scrutinised in the department in consultation with medical and legal advisors. So I imagine not many of them crossed my desk because they were straightforward and were just going to be paid without any further views needed on the application.
Okay, all right, we can take that down, thank you. I'm going to turn then to a separate topic, and the topic of look back, which you referred to in the course of your evidence earlier this morning. If we go to perhaps your witness statement, WITN 5736003, page 19. If we pick it up in your answer at A33, so it's roughly halfway down the page, you say, I was unaware of the decision not to undertake a look-back exercise at the time I took up post as SMO in 1992. I've no clear recollection of when I became aware of the decision. Now, having referred you to that, I'm going to take you, if I may, to some of your evidence to the Penrose inquiry, and just pick up a little more about your understanding of the position prior to 1994, when look back, as it were, came on the agenda. If we go, please, to PRSE 0001169. this is your written statement to the Penrose inquiry, and you were asked, if we look at the bottom half of the page, you were asked the question why a look-back exercise was not commenced in Scotland in September 1991 when hepatitis C anti-HCV testing commenced. And you said in your answer there, you can't answer this question from first-hand knowledge, as I was not a government medical officer in 1991. As far as I can gather from reading papers subsequently, it was not thought feasible for logistical reasons. There was a feeling that a look-back exercise would be very difficult to undertake. The first step which would require to be taken would be for SMBTS to check their donor records to ascertain whether retained samples existed. If retained samples were held, they would require to be tested. The next step would be to check hospital records to trace the recipients. It's not always possible for hospital records to be located. The third step would have been tracking down and testing the recipients. And then there's a reference to Dr. Gillen's pilot study. And then you say a separate issue was that in 1991 and for several years thereafter, there was no available treatment for HCV. So can I ask you first of all about the logistical reasons and the thought that it was not feasible? What was it that was thought to be so problematic that look back couldn't even be attempted until the pilot study revealed otherwise?
Well, a number of the issues are highlighted in this paragraph. Perhaps it would be easier if I start by explaining why I think in the southeast Scotland transfusion centre it was demonstrated as feasible, because that centre was based within Edinburgh Royal Infirmary and had very close links, therefore direct links to the clinical service. So the checking of hospital records to trace recipients would have been much easier in that setting than in many hospitals or many settings throughout Scotland, the rest of Scotland, and indeed the UK, because most most transfusion centres are at a distance from the main hospitals that they supply. For example, in Glasgow, the regional transfusion centre was based in Law Hospital, which is miles outside of Glasgow. So it was separated by many miles from the main hospitals in Glasgow that it supplied. So that's one of the difficulties. Dr. Gillen also, he had been a gastroenterologist before he moved to the transfusion service. So he had very, very good clinical links with the hepatologists who might be looking after patients who had been transfused. So the logistical difficulties were very considerable, not least checking hospital records to trace recipients. And then, of course, the tracking down and testing of those recipients. And the fact is that, and this emerged in the course of the look back, that many patients, of course, would have died of other causes or moved house. So all of these reasons contributed, I think, to the feeling that this just wouldn't be possible.
Well, something not being possible is obviously rather different from something being difficult. Would you accept in principle, would you consider in principle that the state has an ethical obligation to undertake a look back to find and help those infected with blood transfusion? So infected through blood transfusion?
Yes.
And so clearly if that's simply not possible, it can't be done. The steps that you've outlined here, the 3 steps outlined here, may well not be easy, may well involve quite a lot of work, but were they good enough reasons, in your view, looking back now, recognising you weren't involved in a decision in 1991, were they good enough reasons not to initiate a look back?
Well, hindsight's a great thing. Clearly, the look back did eventually take place and was demonstrated to be feasible, although the difficulties encountered in other bits of Scotland, particularly the West, I've already mentioned, and indeed the rest of the UK, were very, very considerable. And I think that Jack Gillam, in the publication on his study, I think it was in 94, can't quite remember, absolutely acknowledges the fact that where he was placed in southeast Scotland, it made it easier to do the look-back exercise than in many other areas. However, the look-back exercise, of course, in principle, or our look-back exercise should always be undertaken. And it's clear that history demonstrates that the difficulties that are described in this paragraph were indeed overcome, and the UK look back took place.
The second factor you've identified in this paragraph is in the last sentence, the issue of there being no available treatment for hepatitis C in 1991 and for several years thereafter. Now, that may of course be correct, but is it not important for people to know if they've been infected with hepatitis C, even if there are no available treatments for that condition, because they may, for example, be able to make choices about how they are living, choices to try and safeguard their health as much as possible. It might provide an explanation to them for symptoms that they're experiencing and can't understand. And it may, of course, mean that they are more likely to go for checks and for example, liver disease to be picked up at an earlier stage than might otherwise be the case. Would you accept that?
I would accept that.
And then can I just ask you then to look at the passage in your oral evidence to the Penrose inquiry?
Before you do that, can I just understand the particular difficulty that comes about when somebody who is performing a check is not in the same hospital as the records that they're looking to check? So if you're in hospital A and in a department which is separate from the records department, plainly, physically, it's easier to walk down the corridor and do the check if you're doing it yourself. The way the look back would work, would that not be asking the records department itself to do the check?
Well, I think, as you said, my lord, that if the transfusion centre is juxtaposed with the clinical service that it is supplying with blood and blood products, then it's easy for the SNBTS clinician to walk down the corridor, speak to whatever consultant in charge of the identified recipient, and ask them to facilitate the examination of the hospital records. It would have to be done at clinical level. You couldn't just send a request to another hospital, to medical records, saying, can you look through these? I think in most cases it would be direct contact between the transfusion service and whoever they thought was in charge of the person at the time they received the transfusion. So that physical distancing just adds to the difficulties. And as I said earlier, Jack Gillam had his own clinical network within the environment in which he was based, which made, I would imagine, his pilot study much easier to undertake.
What would prevent the use of the telephone?
Oh, nothing. No, nothing. But I just I mean, this was not my personal experience. I wasn't in post at this time. So my understanding, based on the papers provided, is that others thought that in other bits of the country, it would just be too difficult.
So this is not...
Right, of course, there are means of contacting people other than face-to-face, even back then.
So what is set out here as your own view is actually really saying, well, this is what others thought at the time, is it?
That's exactly so. And I say at the top of the paragraph, I can't answer the question from first-hand knowledge, but from reading papers, this is what I've gathered.
I see. So you're reflecting other people's reasoning.
Yes.
Would you for yourself, having listened to Council's questions, still think that, or if you ever thought, I don't know if you did, that the question of available treatments had anything to do with whether there should really be a look back or not?
I think probably my view would have been, as Council has outlined, that even though there was no available treatment, there were perhaps other things that those recipients could be doing, keeping an eye on their own health, attending clinics, etc., even in the absence of treatment. And indeed, we now know that, for example, hepatitis C is transmissible through sexual activity, so in a small number of cases. So individuals could have made adjustments to their lifestyle, as well as staying in closer touch with the health service, I guess. So yes, I don't think anybody felt that the lack of availability of treatment was the main problem here. The main issue identified, as far as I can see from my reading of the papers of the time, is the logistical reasons rather than the absence of treatment. That was just another issue.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Can I ask you to look at a passage in your oral evidence to the Penrose inquiry, Professor Keel? It's PRSE 0006086. And if we can go, Lawrence, to page 157. And if we pick it up in line 2 onwards, you say there that you hope you made it clear in your earlier evidence that having heard Jack Gillen present, I was absolutely convinced that proceeding with look back was the right thing to do for a whole raft of reasons. And that's referring to a meeting in May 1994, which we'll come on to. And then the question is, I'm talking about before that, and you say this at line 7, I suppose I share the collective mindset of the time that the look back would not be feasible, that logistically it would be impossible to conduct a look back. I just wanted to explore with you, Professor Keel, that idea of a collective mindset, which is a theme across a range of areas of decision-making that the inquiry has explored with other witnesses. There are obviously dangers to a collective mindset, which is that things don't get looked at again or don't get looked at as quickly as they should do again. Do you have any observations on that and on how, having regard to your time advising the Scottish Home and Health Department and the Scottish Executive's Health Department, how that collective mindset, whether on this issue or other issues, can or should be challenged by civil servants?
Well, yes, collective mindset has got a horrible feeling of groupthink about it, doesn't it? So absolutely, it needs to be challenged. And I think as a new SMO coming into post, my feeling is I had a pretty open mind on a lot of these issues. But, you know, there was a very firm view, a prevalent view at that time, both north and south of the border, that a look back would just not be feasible. And I know you're going to come on to it, but when it became clear to me as an individual, based on Jack Gillen's presentation of the 18th of May 1994, I absolutely bucked the collective mindset and made sure that the look back was initiated.
Let's look then at the meeting in May 1994. It is at PRSE 0003-685. So we can see it's a meeting of the SNBTS Medical and Scientific Committee, 18th of May 1994, and we can see a number of attendees there, including yourself and of course Dr. Gillen. If we turn to page 5, we can see under the heading AOCB at the bottom of the page, HCV Look Back. This very complex and extremely important issue was discussed at length. The committee unanimously agreed that on finding a known or regular donor who was now anti-HCV POS, the SNBTS should, and then there are a number of steps set out in paragraphs 1 through to 4, and paragraph 4 refers to the forthcoming publication from Dr. Gillen, who was going to circulate a pre-publication copy. And then this is recorded at paragraph 5. From a SHHD perspective, AK, that's you, Professor Keel, expressed a view that the SHHD may not have a locus in this matter, and that the SNBTS should make a decision on look-back for HCV that was based on their professional judgment. However, before SNBTS took any action, AK asked to be given the opportunity to discuss the issues with SHHD colleagues to seek their views, and asked that the SNBTS take no formal action until she'd subsequently contacted JDC. That, I think, is Professor Cash, I take it. Once AK had communicated the SHHD position to JDC and provided SHHD were in agreement that the SNBTS should implement this policy, JDC would write to DMAC, that's Mr. McIntosh, I assume, to provide details of the SNBTS policy, thereby allowing a decision to be taken on a starting date for the process. JDC would formally advise National Blood Authority, etc., etc. If SHHD agreed that SNBTS should develop and implement a look-back policy for HCV, AK subsequently would communicate this to DOH. Now, first of all, Professor Keel, what's your recollection, if any now, of that meeting and of what you've described elsewhere and in your Penrose evidence as being Dr. Gillen's presentation?
Well, actually, my memory of it is very vivid because it was such an important event in this saga of should there or should there not be a look back. Two things strike me about these minutes. First of all, that this matter is considered under AOCB rather than as a full agenda item. I think that's curious. You have to bear in mind this was SNBTS's meeting, nothing to do with Scottish government. And the other thing, too, is that the minuting launches into the decision that had been made by the committee, rather than saying Dr. Gillen gave a presentation of his South East Scotland pilot study in HCV look back. And that's what I remember about the afternoon. For the very first time, I saw clearly from what Jack Gillen presented what had been found, and most importantly, the fact that it was indeed feasible. I further remember that we broke for tea after this segment, and an SNBTS colleague told me at tea that Professor Cash intended to speak to Harold Gunson, his opposite number in England, the head of the National Blood Association, to tell him that Scotland had made a decision and that we were going ahead with look back. Well, that absolutely horrified me because, as you can see from the minutes, although I naively said, and this is recorded in Penrose, I naively said SHHD may not have a locus. You know, it's up to you professionally as to whether you think you should be able to go at, or you should go ahead with this. So parking that naivety, I made it very, very clear that before they took any action, I needed to discuss with colleagues back in St Andrew's House, and that they should take no formal action until I'd subsequently contacted John Cash. So when I heard that he might at that very moment be on the phone to Harold Gunson, I packed up my things, jumped in the car, went back to St Andrew's House, sought out my colleague Rob Panton, who was one of George Tucker's team, told him what had happened. I probably said I put my foot in it, by the way, by saying that we didn't really have a locus. Clearly we had a locus, an enormous locus, in deciding whether this should go ahead. I think we then went in to see George Tucker, and that, to me, was the tipping point for the decision made at UK level, ultimately, to proceed with the HCV look back.
If we just go back to those 3 paragraphs in the bottom half of page 6, please, Lawrence, if we just zoom in on those paragraphs again. Leaving aside the issue of the SHHD's locus, what appears to be contemplated here is that the introduction of a look back in Scotland would be a matter for Scotland, if I can put it that way, and it would be for the Department of Health to take its own separate decision. That appears to be what's envisaged in the last paragraph. If SHHD agree that SNBTS should develop and implement a look-back policy for HCV, AK subsequently would communicate this to DOH. Is that right, that this was indeed regarded as something Scotland could do on its own?
Well, I think that paragraph, paragraph 7, is really a further reflection of my naivety at this point. I was not steeped in the background to resistance to conducting a look back, as perhaps many around that table were. And I certainly was not fully aware of the resistance that there had been, not just in Scotland, but across the UK to undertaking this. So, yes, I naively said that, you know, if we agreed in St Andrew's House that we would go ahead with it in Scotland and tell DOH, of course that would never have been a good position for the recipients of HCV-infected products to be in. We needed to tackle this at UK level, and indeed that's what subsequently happened.
If we pick matters up then in September of 1994 at PRSE 000367, this is a meeting of the Advisory Committee on the Microbiological Safety of Blood and Tissues for Transplantation at 29th of September 1994. And we can see the observers on this occasion, in terms of the Scottish representation, Mr. Tucker is there, and paragraph 2, if we just go further down the page, we can see you were not there. Apologies for absence received from, amongst others, yourself. If we go on to page 4, paragraph 6.4 records Mr. Tucker's contribution. Mr. Tucker said that approaches to institute HCV look back in Scotland had been resisted, and it was important that a UK-wide approach was adopted. Dr. George and Dr. Mock said that the WO Welsh Office and DHSS Northern Ireland were also in favour of a UK-wide policy on HCV look back. Dr. Raymond said that there have been difficulties in tracing back in the context of the scheme of payments for those infected with HIV through blood and tissue transfer because of deficiencies in hospital recording. There also appeared to be variation between centres in the treatment given to HCV-positive haemophiliacs. And then there's a reference in 6.5 to an SMBTS paper, and then 6.6 to members submitting written comments, which will be considered before the next committee meeting. Are you able to help us understand a little more Mr. Tucker's contribution? Approaches to institute HCV look back in Scotland had been resisted. It's slightly curious wording. Resisted by whom? By the Scottish Home and Health Department or by others?
Well, it's always difficult to interpret someone else's remarks, especially at this distance, but I think perhaps he was reflecting the view of the transfusion service, that it would not be feasible to conduct a look-back exercise. I mean, I've already mentioned the west of Scotland in particular, where it was thought that the logistical hurdles that would have to be overcome would be insurmountable. But clearly that view would have been reflected to government over the years. So I think perhaps George Tucker was saying that government and the transfusion service had resisted until now, until then, the idea of undertaking a look-back exercise.
If we then move in terms of the sequence of decision-making to the next meeting of the Advisory Committee on the Microbiological Safety of Blood and Tissues for Transplantation, it's PRSE 303635, please, Lawrence. And these are the minutes of the meeting on the 15th of December 1994, and you were back present as an observer on behalf of SHHD. If we go to page 5, the bottom half of the page, section 7 of the minutes, is where the discussion on HCV look-back commences. And we've looked at this before, Professor Keel, in the inquiry, so I'm not going to read it out, but we can see there's a discussion there set out. If we go to your contribution, which is page 7, if we pick it up first of all in the third paragraph, it's the first of two paragraphs numbered 7.10, curiously. CMO said that in the public interest, an urgent decision on a UK-wide basis was needed on the matters of principle. The detail was important but less urgent. And then 7.10 records you saying the view in Scotland was that the Secretary of State was vulnerable as look-back was feasible since donors could be identified and traced. And advice from Scottish office lawyers was that look-back should start immediately. The chairman stressed the need for maintaining uniformity in the UK, but said that it was for the Secretaries of State, not the committee, to decide on whether Scotland should go ahead early. And then there's a discussion in the next paragraph, and then paragraph 712, I'm not going to read it out, but refers to the committee's advice to ministers, which was essentially to go ahead with a look-back exercise. What was it that underpinned your contribution to this discussion, Dr. Keel? a sense, is it that the Secretary of State for Scotland could be subject to legal action if a look-back did not now take place?
Well, that was one element, but by no means the most important. I firmly believe by this stage that having demonstrated in one part of Scotland that a look back was feasible, that we were all duty bound to then make it happen across the rest of the country. I think it's indicative that the CMO, Ken Kalman, attended this meeting. He didn't usually, in fact, he never, apart from this occasion, was at the meeting. So it was obviously a very, very important topic. By this stage in Scotland, we had legal as well as medical advice that the look back was feasible, and therefore the legal advice to Secretary of State understandably was, well, if you don't go ahead with this in Scotland, you may be vulnerable. But that wasn't the main driver. The main driver was the increasing view, I think, I may as well say instigated by me, that we needed to do this because it had been demonstrated that it was feasible to undertake look back.
I explored with you a few minutes ago your thoughts as to why a look back hadn't been initiated earlier. Do you have any sense of whether a fear of litigation played a part in that earlier decision making not to have a look back? In other words, a fear that those who were traced through a look back might have a cause of action arising out of their infection?
I don't know is the answer, but from my reading of the papers, that did not emerge as a reason.
Can I then just pick up the decision making specifically in relation to Scotland with a couple of, or two or three further documents. PRSE 0001781. This is a letter dated the 22nd of December 1994. It's from Lord Fraser, who was the Minister for Home Affairs and Health within the Scottish Office, and it was addressed to Tom Sackville, the Parliamentary Under Secretary of State at the Department of Health. We can see the heading, Hepatitis C virus, look back exercise, and it records in the first paragraph as follows, perhaps just picking it up halfway down that paragraph. Part of the reason for this lack of any follow-up action was a concern that it would be impossible to identify all recipients of infected blood, and even if it were possible, there was a lack of accepted treatment which would be beneficial, and we've already discussed that issue, Professor Keel. But then it continues as follows. It was accepted that if no effective treatment was available, informing those patients who were unaware of their situation could not be justified, since this would cause further distress and anxiety without any benefit. Now, that's not the view that you expressed, Professor Keel, a few minutes ago in response to my questions and the questions of the chair. But it would seem from this that it was at least part and parcel of the thinking within the Scottish Home and Health Department, otherwise it wouldn't have found its way in a ministerial letter. Do you have any recollection of this issue featuring in discussions or deliberations about look back?
No, I think this sentence probably reflects previous thinking, which may well have predated my arrival in the department, around the reasons that were proffered against conducting a look back. But I don't remember distress and anxiety being a feature of the discussions around this time.
The next paragraph then refers to the work of Dr. Gillen, and if we pick it up again in the fourth line, the advice which I've received from medical and legal staff is that as such a look-back exercise is practicable and the Secretary of State and I have a duty to undertake the exercise as soon as possible. And then there's a reference to the possibility of liability. And then it says this: I'm conscious that the matter of a look-back policy for HCV was considered by the MSBT at their recent meeting, and that they have advised that procedures should be put in place to identify those at risk. But whatever is done should be done equally and uniformly throughout the UK. That's a quote from the MSBT recommendations. The committee has also recommended that guidance should be drawn up, but this leaves unresolved the question of timing of the introduction and the implementation of the look-back exercise. The advice which I've received from my medical and legal staff is such that I consider it's no longer a matter of policy, but of legal liability, and that the look-back should take place as soon as possible in Scotland. I'm informed that the SNBTS is ready to carry out such an exercise, and I have no alternative but to instruct them to proceed. I appreciate that there are sensitivities in proceeding in advance of the rest of the UK, but given that it may be some time before all parts are ready, I consider that I have little choice but to take this forward in view of the position in Scotland. I shall ensure you'll be kept informed of the progress of this exercise, since I recognise that this may have value as a pilot for any similar exercise elsewhere in the UK, although I would not, of course, wish our action to be presented or seen as a pilot exercise. And then he says, I accept that any exercise may encourage further pressure for compensation for those infected, but we shall continue to resist this robustly in line with our general policy. And then this: we shall not, of course, be publicising the look-back exercise and shall do all we can to avoid media interest. If, however, direct questions are asked, it would be difficult to avoid answering them. And then he says he hopes that Mr Sackville will understand the Scottish circumstances make it imperative that action is taken now. So two questions, Professor Keel. The first arises out of that paragraph about not publicising the look-back exercise, avoiding media interest. Do you have any thoughts or observations about that paragraph, given what might be said to be the advantages in public health terms of doing the opposite of what Lord Fraser is here recommending?
Well, I think this paragraph reflects the place we are in the chronology of developing the look back. This was very, very early stages. Only South East Scotland had done the exercise. The rest of Scotland, and indeed the rest of the UK, had some considerable catching up to do. So I imagine that was what was in Lord Fraser's mind when he says that we won't be publicising the look-back exercise. But the look-back exercise, once it got underway, was indeed very well publicised. I suppose that my view would be that there's no point in announcing something with a big fanfare if the operational arrangements are not in place, and they weren't at that stage.
And then the second point arising out of this letter really emerges from the paragraphs above. We have, if we just look back over the documents that we've looked at together, Professor Keel, we've got we've got the meeting in May 1994 suggesting the possibility of Scotland going ahead of other parts of the United Kingdom. We have Mr Tucker in September 1994 appearing to discourage that and saying, no, it should be UK-wide. And now we have Lord Fraser here saying, well, we're ready in Scotland, we want to go ahead, rather than necessarily wait for the rest of the United Kingdom. Are you able to assist us in understanding that slightly shifting picture, or whether in truth, was there any impediment to Scotland's ever just going it alone? Was there ever really a need to wait for the rest of the United Kingdom to catch up?
No, in terms of policy, and clearly Lord Fraser's views on this were informed by the legal advice which said it's no longer a matter of policy, but of legal liability. So he had absolutely no choice but to press the green button to roll out the exercise across Scotland. But it was always, and Scotland was included in this, considered absolutely desirable to do this on a UK basis. And we saw in the minutes of MSBT that both Wales and Northern Ireland were keen to do that too. So the push from the start was that this should end up a UK exercise, however, recognising that bits of the country would take longer to get up to speed in order to participate.
And then, I note the time, I was about to go to another document, but we won't finish this topic before lunch, sir, so I can pick it up at 2.
We're already breaking into the lunch hour, I think.
I'm sorry.
I understand that there'll be a slightly shorter period after lunch than we normally have, not least because there's going to be a fire alarm, I gather, where you are, at 3 o'clock, and therefore we need to finish the first session before 3 to avoid being cut off by noises off in the middle of a question, or middle of an answer, which would be even worse. We'll take a break now then until 2 o'clock.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.